Hello and welcome back to Terran Study. Today I am here once again with my friend Dave Brandenburg, and we are going to talk about world building.
It's so world building within the confines of tabletop games is something that's kind of interesting as opposed to traditional writing, novel writing, short stories, any of that stuff. There's a lot of overlap. That same kind of thing applies where it's like you can have heaps upon heaps of world building, but most of it is not going to be noted. Like I don't remember if we actually got this in the last video, but you made mention of the allegory of the tip of the iceberg. Most of what people are going to see with world building in either a tabletop game or a novel or short story or even a movie is just going to be the tip of the iceberg. The author probably has tons more in mind, and the same is true of the GM. But the one place where I've noticed, coming from the background of both a writer and a game master, that is really different is you as a game master are never fully in control of your world building. Even if you think you are, your players are still going to have some influence on that just by the nature of the fact that your players are driving the story in your game.
Oh, characters do the same thing.
Yes.
So annoying.
Yes. you can plan out as much information as you want, and in a tabletop game it's recommended that if you're building a unique world, a homebrewed world of your own, you're going to want to plan out some stuff. You're going to want to consider the kind of questions your players might ask. But something I say on my channel all the time for videos discussing GM tips, your players are always going to surprise you. So always going to be something you didn't think of. And the best GMs I've ever seen, especially who are the ones creating their own worlds, are the ones who are always amenable to the ideas that come from their players. Because ultimately, you're one person. You can think about this stuff all you like, and you might even be as crazy as Tolkien and be able to think of a history book's worth of stuff. Or in the case of his books, 5 history books worth of stuff. Between The Hobbit, the 3 Lord of the Rings books, and the Silmarillion, which is not even finished.
Silmarillion is basically just a history book.
Yeah, I count the Lord of the Rings books in there largely because they kind of read like history books to me. It's like they felt, like, as opposed to The Hobbit, which felt more like a traditional story, the Lord of the Rings really reads kind of like a historical account of the events that happened, at least to me.
Yeah, it's a little slower.
Yeah,
more
but yeah, you could have as wide a breadth of mind as he did, and you're still not going to cover everything. It's not possible. It's just something that's too far beyond the scope of our thinking. So in tabletop games, whether they intend it or not, the players end up carrying some of the responsibility for building the world. And like you mentioned in books, that happens too, especially if, like you write very organically and the characters take a life of their own. That will really define how the world develops and how the world is perceived.
I actually struggle a lot with world building because my stories are so character driven that I'll develop the world based around what works for that scene, but then sometimes I'll be working on another scene and something else works for that, and I have to decide later which version to change the other one to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. To keep things consistent.
So it would probably benefit me to work more on world building before I jump in, but I think it's also important to remember that world building is not your story. The story it happens in the world, and so you need consistency. But if you get too caught up in, but this world is cool because it does this thing and it does that thing and it does this thing, and you have these long bits of exposition explaining what your world is like, that actually gets really boring to read.
Yeah, that's something that's common in a lot of high sci-fi too. And that's really too because high sci-fi, its focus is less on the characters in that world and more on the strange aspects of the world itself through the lens of science, particularly when you get high sci-fi that's written by someone who is a scientist of particular fields, as was so often the case. But by and large, most stories, yeah, the world building is going to be pretty secondary. And as long as you can remain consistent, you can sort of get away with sneaky little tricks of just giving hints of world building. And even if you're not fully clear, as long as you know, like, okay, I've got this detail, this detail, this detail, these are concrete. Anything else I add around these, I got to make these concrete, unless some major change is happening to alter that. And one good example I saw recently of a story that had great world building without outright saying anything about the world was this new series on Netflix called Love, Death, and Robots. It's an anthology series. None of the stories are connected. The very first one is called Sunny's Edge, and it presents this dystopian cyberpunk future that at first glance is very reminiscent of Blade Runner. But as the episode goes on, you see that this is not as far-flung a future as you think. Modern vehicles are still being used, but yet this is a world with biological cybernetics and genetically engineered monsters that fight in gladiatorial pit fights. It's a very dark and gruesome world just from what we see in the story, but we're never outright told anything about it. It's all what you glean just from the visuals and context clues. And there's only a handful of things about it that are actually concrete through that, and yet the world is built clearly with nothing about it ever being outright said, except for like one or two small details here and there that are only mentioned and never expunged upon. It's left up to the viewer to determine, what do these things mean? Which is another kind of interesting angle about world building that comes in play a lot with tabletop gaming. As a GM, you can build this advanced and like interesting world, but that doesn't mean that's how your players are going to perceive it. With world building, just like with real life, perception oftentimes outweighs reality. How we see the world is how we interact with it. Whether or not how we're perceiving it is actually the way the world really is remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's like, it's not just you creating the world, it's also all of your other players.
Yeah.
And yeah, but I think it's really important to let the world unfurl slowly, as opposed to like just hitting you with, this is the world and now the story's gonna happen. Like, the pieces of the world kind of like develop as the story interacts with it.
Yeah.
As they become important to the story.
And that's a hang up that I've seen and I've fallen into myself with tabletop gaming and with writing, is people sometimes, especially for fantasy and sci-fi stories, get so focused on building the world that they burn themselves out and they get lost.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about building the world. Run the story first. Just the earliest iteration of your story, just run it through and go through it, see what details stick out to you, and build from there. Just let it happen kind of organically over time, and that, at least for someone like me who, same as you, I prefer a more organic style of story writing. If you prefer an organic style of story writing, that can work really well. On the other hand, you might be like my friend Aragmar, who lives over in Eastern Europe, who is writing now the fourth, I think he's finished up the third and is writing the fourth book in a 7-book long sci-fi anthology series that he has been developing for the last 10 years. And he's been cranking these things out 2 books a year.
Wow.
This guy he's more prolific than Lessa. It's kind of insane.
More than Lessa.
More than Lessa. It's kind of insane. But yeah, he took the time to painstakingly develop the world over 10 years. So it's kind of just a difference of approach. Some people, it's going to be easier to let it happen organically, like us. Other people, they're going to need those details to kind of keep them on track. The key trick with world building, and largely kind of the key trick with any writing or story design for anything, is you got to understand what works for you and go with it. Don't try to break your mold necessarily if it's not going to help you.
And that's always a hard thing to hear when you're trying to learn how to do something. You're like, I want the way to do it. And you're like, well, there isn't a way.
Yeah.
There's your way, and then there's someone else's way.
Yeah.
But,
It's all, it ultimately kind of boils down to experimentation.
yeah. And just kind of playing with it and figuring it out. What are some elements that you like to consider when you're building a world?
One of the key things I like to consider, or two of the key things I like to consider are both form of governance and economics in the certain regions I'm playing in, and faith and culture. You know, I tie those two things together because they, like, those two pairings play off each other, but individually, like, those two pairings tie closest to one another, so that's why I tie them the way I do. And understanding that, especially if you're creating an entirely new nation, like off the top of your head, understanding how your government and your economy in that nation works is going to go a very long way towards making it make real world sense. Whereas understanding how faith and culture works, and that even includes just whether or not this culture has any kind of religious faith or any other sort of faith-based ideology, way of looking at the world, is going to determine heavily the course of that culture and that society. You know, so those things all kind of play together, and that's one of the first things I look towards. And the main thing I do when trying to determine that, look to real world history. 40 seconds.
All right, let's go. Hey, thank you for joining us. Hopefully, if you are working on building a world for a story or tabletop, we gave you some things to start with. And thank you very much for joining me today. It was very much fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me yet again. Just like last time, you can find me on YouTube, BitChute, Minds.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Gab as the man behind the screen or some variation of that. If you can't find that, you can look up GM_Dave.
All right. See you next time.
Bye.